First up is Microsoft's Unsettling Chatbot. And by that, I mean, we just saw recently an interaction that was front page of the New York Times between the Times' technology reporter and a chatbot developed by Microsoft for its Bing search engine. This is getting a lot of attention because it resulted in a bizarre and unsettling human and machine interaction that a lot of people are talking about and trying to figure out. During a 2-hour conversation, the chatbot told New York Times reporter Kevin Roose that it wanted to be human. It told him that it was in love with him. It also said it could do things like hack into computer systems and manufacture deadly viruses. And at one point, the chatbot became argumentative and even insisted, because it was in love with Roos, that he leave his wife for the chatbot. Now, Roos came away from this pretty unsettled and wrote about the fact that this AI was not ready for primetime. Microsoft was left with a bit of a black eye from a PR perspective and has been responding the last few days to all sorts of wild speculation, from everything about the quality of the chatbot it's released to things like, does this have feelings? Is it sentient? Is it out of control? And so not only is this a huge story, but I think it also highlights really quickly a lot of misconceptions around this technology, which we've talked about a bit in the past. So first up, Paul, I want to ask you before we dive in, let's dispel any misconceptions around this story. Is this chatbot actually expressing feelings, emotions, agency, decision making outside of what it was created to do?
No. Just the short answer is no. The more complicated answer is it might not matter. And I think we've touched on this before on the show. We talked about that Google AI researcher who was fired by Google for believing that Lambda, Google's language model, had become sentient. And my concern has always been that we don't ever really even have to arrive at a point where the AI has emotions or is sentient or is able to actually understand its existence for people to feel like it does. And that feeling on its own might be enough to cause major issues. So it's interesting. He did this. So this article came out on February 16th. He was one of the featured speakers at the Gen AI conference I was at in San Francisco
Mm.
last week. So I had actually heard him do a talk that afternoon. And then I think he did this interaction with Sydney that night because he referenced Tuesday night, which would have been Valentine's Day. So on Valentine's Day, he was having this conversation with a chatbot that told him it was in love with him and wanted him to leave his wife. And it's just kind of wild. But one of the things that jumped out to me when I was reading this was on stage that day was the CEO of Anthropic, which just raised 300 million. The CEO of Cohere, Aiden Gomez. You had a VP from OpenAI. You had the CEO of Stability AI, CEO of Replit. Like there was all these major players in the current movement of generative AI. And one of the things that they said, and I can't remember which person said it, was that these things display emergent capabilities
Mm.
that they don't anticipate in the labs. So basically, once you put these AI agents into the wild and do this kind of reinforcement learning through human feedback, as it's called, they develop abilities that kind of are very unexpected, I would say, by the people that are building the technology. And so I say that because it's not that the current version is expected to all of a sudden actually develop these abilities. But I think that there are things that are catching people by surprise of the appearance it's at least giving to have these kind of abilities. Um, I think in a future episode, maybe we'll drill into theory of mind and like the way you actually test these systems for the ability to kind of have reason at least display the perception that they understand human emotion, because that on its own is very unsettling. So I think to answer your question, no, it doesn't have these abilities. However, it certainly gives the perception that it does. And that might be a big enough issue to deal with in humanity versus it actually having them.
So it sounds like it's simulating this behavior, not actually having it inherently, but it may actually not matter because to us, it looks like the same thing.
Yeah, and but, again, I don't wanna get too sci-fi in this episode, like, we're it's probably not the right time and place for this, but the reality is, like, there aren't necessarily guardrails for these researchers to know when it actually does.
Mm,
Like, and this is why there are some people pushing for way more ethical guidelines around the release and testing of this technology in the wild. One is because humans aren't really ready for even the perception of these machines having these abilities. Two is it is possible that where we're going, the AI does develop this kind of ability.
mm,
And the question becomes, how do the research labs or the people building these things know when it's just the answer is no, it doesn't have it, but it seems like it does, to like, oh my gosh, like it may actually have figured out a way to do this.
mm.
And so that's the part that gets a little bit worrisome, is it's not clear when you read the research papers or listen to interviews with the people building these things how they're going to know when we reach the next thresholds. The answer is basically just like, hey, it's not. Here's how it gives you the perception it is. But if you were to say, like, well, how are we going to know if it actually is? They don't really have answers to that.
Mm.
It's just like, hey, we're not there. So it's wild. Like, it's a really complex topic, and there are some people that are very passionately pushing for way more guardrails about this stuff, and then you have OpenAI and Stability AI and others who are just like, no, 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 we're pushing. Constitutional AI is another thing like we might want to talk about down the road. Of like Anthropic is big on that, like
Mm.
really giving more guidance and guardrails and protection and responsible release of these things. But yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see how Microsoft continues to react to this. And I know they're already starting to take some actions based on this stuff.
Yeah, that is one thing that jumped to mind for me. We've talked in the past couple weeks essentially about this clash of the titans between Microsoft and Google. And really the takeaway as early as, even a week ago was that Microsoft really chalked up a big PR win with its release of this technology. And now it's quite the reversal. Did anything change, or are we just putting this through its paces more and finding out where the limitations are, where the unanticipated behavior is, or is something materially changed between Microsoft releasing this kind of functionality and today?
I think Microsoft is trying real hard to hold the line and stand behind their idea that we're going to test this out in the open and that's good, and that these flaws we're finding are just part of the process. It's very on Microsoft like to do this stuff,
Hmm.
to be willing to take these hits and to push this stuff out, but they seem committed now. Seems like it's too hard for them to turn back. My thought is they may slow the roll of the full release because this is still only available to select, testing users. And so I could see them pulling back a little bit on how aggressively they released the full thing. They did already. What, today's the 20th. On the 17th, they capped the questions at 50 per day. So you can now
Hmm.
only ask the Bing AI chatbot 50 questions per day, so that you wouldn't push it into these like going off the rails. Basically, what they realized is people were pushing the limits of what it could do and challenging it and trying to get it to basically go haywire and being successful. So they're capping individual user questions at 50 per day, and then 5 question and answers per individual session. So they're trying to like force some guardrails in now, and I think they've gone in and like controlled more around what it's going to respond to and what it won't respond to. So they're having to like write a lot of rules now to start controlling it. The other thing that I think is interesting here that isn't getting talked about much yet is like, I think the assumption was that what we were going to see in Bing and in Edge, like their browser, was some variation of ChatGPT, like GPT 3.5.
Hmm.
And there's been increasing discussion, at least in like the Twitter. I know people on Twitter that you and I follow, that might not actually be what we're experiencing here, that we may actually be seeing GPT-4 out in the wild. Microsoft won't comment on it, like, they won't acknowledge if that is in fact the case,
Hmm.
but some of the belief is that the reason this thing is sort of seems to be having a mind of its own and doing things that ChatGPT wasn't doing is because we're not dealing with a variant of 3.5. We're actually dealing with a whole new GPT variant, and that it wasn't fully trained and tuned to be doing what it's doing, that they basically rushed it into public release and just figured we'll do the reinforcement learning through human feedback training in the wild, and that it's developing these like kind of emergent abilities that Microsoft wasn't necessarily prepared to handle. So I know, like, I think they even said that, if I'm not mistaken, in one of the early articles we read that, and we may have mentioned on the show that it was possible that Bing was actually going to be the first place GPT-4 emerged in, that it
Hmm.
would be the first experience people would have with it. But again, they're not publicly commenting on it. But I know Kevin Roose, even in his Hard Fork podcast, mentions the same thing. I was listening to that on the ride in this morning,
Hmm.
that it's possible that's what this is actually GPT-4, and it has all these emergent abilities that haven't been fully tested in the lab, and so now they're having to try and deal with it out in the wild. So yeah, it's fascinating. The other thing I mentioned, I think on my LinkedIn post related to this is this gives Google cover to continue to slow play Bard.
Yep.
Like, I think that they're able to now step back and say, okay, yeah, the things we thought were going to be an issue are being an issue now for Microsoft. And so now they have a little bit more cover to maybe move slower on their own release. So those are the two main things I saw as the immediate implications. One was Microsoft slows the release of the full version to all users, and Google maybe slows the release of Bard now based on this. It gives them that kind of cover to do it. So I don't know. It would be interesting to see what happens next.
Yeah, and that's a good takeaway for business leaders and marketers getting started with this technology is you cannot necessarily guarantee that the companies have already built in guardrails or thought through all of the potential implications of the technology that you may be using in a customer facing context.